Good morning, everybody. Is everybody awake yet after the gathering last night? I heard there might have been some beers served. Just a few. Good, good. Couple things, if my Evernote works here, before we get to the main part. First of all, my name's John Sutcliffe. I'm the engineering team. I guess it'd be good to know who I am. But I wanted to just give a shout out to this community and how wonderful everything is this week, getting to see everybody. And that goes to, there was an API session on Tuesday, and there was a feature request talked about to be able to update scripts, wondering if that was there. We found out, yes, we actually had implemented that in 9.4. Sometimes we forget to mark those as done. I hadn't had enough coffee yet when I marked on there that this is done, and I typed not implemented, and about 30 seconds later I got an email saying, do you mean not or now? So anyway, you guys are great, keeping us honest and going. The other thing, there were a couple of defects mentioned as well about when you're updating scripts and policies and things, line feeds getting mangled and whatnot. And developer fixed those yesterday and today, and those will be in our 9.6.1 or 9.6.2 release due mid to late November. So again, report those things when you see them, talk to your support people, and we'll try to get around to getting those cleaned up as quick as we can. So anyway, you guys are tremendous. Anyway, with that, I want to welcome Chris, a great member of the community as well. I've gotten to know Chris over the years. He's one of the people like you. He keeps us very honest on what we do with the API. I get several emails from him. Hey, if you only did this, my life would be so much easier. I also want to point out the amount of work that he had to put into this. A lot of code was written, but that wasn't it. Dealing with the logistics, many of you who are from a large company know that if you have to do a presentation, sometimes you have to talk to legal people, committees, vice presidents, which is more trouble than the actual presentation. Yeah. So anyway, with that, over to Chris, and we'll do a Q&A after this. So yeah. Thank you.
Well, there's me and John. Yeah, this is going to be fairly technical, but let's dive in. So at JNUC 2012, I was upstairs in the small theater, and I gave a talk about some tools that we use at Pixar, mainly about this thing called D3, which is our package deployment and patch management system, which includes puppy time that entertains the users during a logout install, and D3 admin that provides manual and scriptable deployment of packages even directly from Xcode. We have developers who write in-house software that when they build their software, it immediately goes into the JSS. We also do some stuff like we look at the data in the JSS to find unused software so that we can purge it from machines and not pay for it. We synchronize with our LDAP server because our canonical inventory of computers is in our LDAP server, not our JSS. So we have to do some interesting synchronization. And we keep our network segments up to date because our network team has a Git repository that keeps all the data about our subnets, and we want those reflected in the JSS. So all of this code is done with a library of Ruby code that has been growing for quite a while. And by the time Casper 9 came out, it needed a full rewrite. So for about 2 years, I've been working on that rewrite, and that's what I'm here to talk about. In JNUC 2012, during the Q&A, the very first question was from Mr. Troughton. And unfortunately, I had to say no, but now I can say yes. So that's just on Sunday, I got the go-ahead from my VP to put it on GitHub. And I threw together a little tiny simple HTML page with links to the GitHub repository, the documentation, and the Ruby Gems repository so you can install it. Go there, this will be on the slides at the end, and with some more information. But there it is. So let's dive in. The first thing we're going to talk about is an overview of it. What is it? What do you do with it? Then we'll actually look at working with objects from the API. Then, since this is an open source project, I'm hoping other coders will make it even bigger and better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the guts of how it works and the programming that went into it, so that you'll have an idea of how to join in. And then I've got some screenshots of a couple of example programs. Just a couple little programs that when you install it, you'll get these example programs, and you can just open them up and look at them and see how they work. So there's no way I can cover everything about the gem today, but hopefully I'll give you enough to whet your appetites and get things going. So an overview, what is this thing? The API provides a way to interact with all kinds of objects stored in the JSS. The JSS modular, Ruby module for the JSS that comes as a gem, abstracts those objects as Ruby objects. Ruby, of course, is an object-oriented programming language, so it makes sense to bring your objects and make them into objects. When you create an instance of a class in Ruby from the API, you get a Ruby object with lots of built-in methods to make it really easy to manipulate it. So that's just some of the classes that are in the Ruby module. As of Casper 9.4, the API, and I built it all for 9.4. We haven't had time to go up higher yet, but I'm pretty sure it's all just going to work fine going forward. But there are 58 kinds of objects in the API. I have so far implemented 26 of them. These are the ones that are implemented that through my code you can create, read, update, and delete them in the JSS. These three, computers, mobile devices, and policies, you can read them, you can update some parts of their, I don't know, can you guys see that pointer? Yeah, those are the things that you can update. And you can delete them from the JSS. And then these, you can read them from the JSS and delete them in the JSS. The API can do more than that, but I haven't implemented that in Ruby yet. So there's a few classes and submodules that live inside of the module that don't reflect API objects directly, but they're very useful nonetheless. So for example, there is an object called the API connection. This is the connection from your code to the API. There is a configuration object that stores configuration. So every time you make your connection, you don't have to say your server address and the username. They can be stored in a file locally. You can edit that file with a text editor, or you can use the code to edit that file. And it gets read in as soon as you load the module, and it's just there to be used. There's a server object that just represents the server you're connected to, and some info about that. There's a client object that lets you do things on the machine that you're running the code on, like run the Jamf binary. And there's a little tiny module that I'm calling Composer that makes very simple PKG and DMGs that you can then stick up onto your distribution points. So synchronicity. When you take those objects from the API, they're just data. So you get data about a package, data about a computer, data about a distribution point. It's just data. Once you get that data into a unified framework, those things can talk to each other and do interesting things. So for example, you can pull down a package object, and now you've got a Ruby package object, and that package object has a method called install. And when you say install, it talks to the client object on the local computer, gets its IP address, then it retrieves the network segments to find out which network segment you're on. Then it looks at that network segment to see which distribution point you should use. Then it gets that distribution point, figures out, is it HTTP or should it mount the thing, and then it'll mount it or do whatever, and it'll use the Jamf binary to do the install. Scripts can be run on clients just by saying run. You get your script object and you say run, and it'll just run. Extension attributes and advanced searches can work with inventory objects, meaning users, computers, and mobile devices. And they work together so that you can get like fancy reports that you can't get easily through the UI, and you can do consistency checking so that you don't try to add, say, do I have one more? Oh yeah. Objects that refer to other objects for existence. So say you want to add a limitation to a scope and you want to limit it to a network segment. When you do that, the scope itself will check to see that the network segment exists and give you a reasonable error before you submit it to the JSS and get a 409 error and don't know what it means. So let's take a look at working with these objects. First, we're going to install the JSS, or the JSS gem. So open up a terminal and type gem install JSS API. It'll pull it down from rubygems.org and install it. It will also install a whole bunch of dependencies. It needs these 4 other gems that are freely available, and it'll just automatically install them. Then, once it's installed, you need to connect to the API. So you're going to see some screenshots next to the text here, and they are what's called an IRB session. IRB is a Ruby shell, where you just type Ruby code and it just does it. It's kind of like when you type bash code into a bash shell. So to load in the library, the Ruby command is require, and you say require JSS API, and it loads it all in. Then you need to connect. There's a variable or a constant called API. It has a connect method. You provide it all of that information, and when it executes it, it makes a connection. Now that object is the connection to the JSS. You also can, if you just provide a password, it'll use whatever configuration information that you have set up in the little configuration file. But you cannot store a password in the configuration file. You always have to give it a password somehow. You can provide the password just as an argument to the connect method, or you can ask it to prompt you, or you can pass it into standard in. There's an example of how to make it prompt, and then if you're writing some code in a terminal, it'll just prompt you just like it does there. So once you're connected, what do? The first thing you want to do is list some objects. So whatever object it is you're wanting to list, where it says API object up there, you just call the all method, and you will get a list of them. And in my little sample, I'm looking at all the mobile devices, and right there, that's the beginning of the data for one mobile device. The list is going to be a lot longer. That just gives you a list. It's the same as when you get the list object, or the list from the API itself, and you just say list them all. It's the same data. So sometimes you just want the names or the IDs or the serial numbers of all of them. So you can say all names or all IDs or all serial numbers. Here's an example of all the computer names. Or you can say, a lot of times it's nice to have a mapping of the IDs to some other thing, the IDs to the serial numbers, the IDs to the names. So you can say map all IDs to, and then in this case, I'm saying map all IDs to name, and I get a Ruby hash or a dictionary of ID numbers to names for everything of that class. So what happens when we want to retrieve an object? It's pretty easy. The standard way in Ruby to create a new instance of an object is with the new method. This is making a new Ruby object, not a new JSS object. And you provide either an ID number or a name. For some objects, you can provide a serial number. Anything that you can look up an object by in the actual API, you can use there to grab one. So in my little sample code here, I'm filling a variable with a computer object for the computer named Kimchi. So that variable now contains that object. So once you have that object, the attributes that are stored about the object are accessible as methods to your Ruby object. So simple ones, you just call them as a method call. So if you want the serial number from your computer object, you just say serial number as the method call, and you'll get the serial number back, or the last contact time, or any of the sort of general stuff, or location data is all just there at that top level. You just use a method call. But sometimes it's more complex. You know how the API will give you data in subsets, like hardware data and so on. A lot of that I didn't split all out into individual methods, so there's a hardware method that is a hash of data that has all the stuff for just that subset. The documentation gives you all the details about where all the data is that comes from the API. So updating objects, when you want to update or change something in the JSS, once you have your object in Ruby, so simple ones, you change just with an equal sign. So there's our computer object. We want to change the barcode. You just say it equals that, and we're there. The PO number, the PO date, simple dates, simple values you can do that way. More complex ones can get pretty complex. For example, a policy, here's a policy object that I pulled down. And I want to, as I was talking before, I want to add a limitation to its scope. And I want to add the network segment backups. Well, there is no network segment backups. And if you try to do that just to the API, you're going to get an error because that network segment doesn't exist. And that error won't necessarily make it obvious that it's a non-existent network segment. So my code will catch that. It checks the network segments, and it will give an error that says, hey, that network segment doesn't exist. So then I go, hey, give me all the names of the network segments. And there they are. And oh, that's the one I want. It's called backup LAN. So now I do it. I add a network segment limitation to the scope of the policy. And if I give it the right name, it works. We'll talk about scopes a little more later. Scopes are another object. There's a class called a scope that a policy contains. And other things that use scopes contain them too. So when you're ready, after you've changed your data, you have to send your data back to the JSS. So you just call the update method on your object, and it will send everything back to the JSS. And the save method is an alias of the update method. So either update or save will send the stuff back to the JSS. Notice how you have not seen any XML. It does that all for you. It's all done in the background. So when you want to make a new object in the JSS, you still have to make a new Ruby object first, but you have to give it a special ID. You say the ID is :new, and that tells Ruby that you're making a new one that doesn't yet exist in the JSS. And you always have to give it a name, and you might have to give it other things too, depending on what the JSS requires for that object. So you can see in my sample here, I made a variable that contains a new package object that doesn't yet exist in the JSS. Once you have your Ruby object, you fill in all the variables just like we did in the previous slide. Just fill in whatever data you want in your object, and then you need to create it, and you call the create method. And that makes the new one appear in the JSS. You can also call save, because save is also an alias to create. The save method looks to see whether or not this thing already is in the JSS, and if it is, it updates it, and if it isn't, it creates it. Deleting objects. This is very simple and very dangerous. All of the objects that are implemented can be deleted, and you don't have to do two steps. Like with creating and updating, you've got to do all your work and then send it to the JSS. When you do this, it happens immediately. So here I create a variable to hold a category, and then I call delete on it, and it's done. And because this is Ruby, I don't even have to bother with the variable. I can just do it all on one line. I just pull down the existing one from the JSS and delete it immediately. So that's the basics of how you use it in your code. You just call down objects and let them talk to each other and do what you want with them. So that section was all about using it, or the basics of using it, but now I'm going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to talk about how the gem is programmed itself. Of course, I've written it for our own environment, and we don't need to use most of what's in the API, so I haven't implemented a lot of things. But hopefully, when you see that it's not that hard and how flexible it is, some of you can improve it and add new classes to do what you need and share it with everyone. So whether you're using it just to write your own code or you're actually improving the gem itself, read the online documentation. The source code itself is very heavily documented. That is one method. It's hard, you can't really read it up there, but that's the uninstall method from the package object. And all the light blue stuff up top, that's comments. And those comments can get parsed by documentation parsers and generate really nice HTML documentation that's all available online. If any of you have done any Objective-C programming, the style of that documentation is very, very similar. It talks about the various classes, whether and the methods they have, whether they're class methods or instance methods, and all of their parameters, and it's all defined in there. So class inheritance, if you've done any work with object-oriented languages, you know that classes can inherit from other classes all of their properties and methods and stuff like that. So the top sort of level of class that I implement is this abstract concept of an API object. An API object defines all of the stuff that is common to all of the objects in the API. For example, they all have names, they all have ID numbers, they all can be deleted, they all have lists. You want to list all of them or list all their names. So those methods are defined in this abstract object. And then all the API objects are subclasses of that. So for example, a distribution point inherits from an API object and adds to it the concept of a master distribution point or my distribution point. My distribution point is the one that's correct for me based on my network segment. That's all defined in the distribution point class. Sometimes there's several levels of inheritance. For example, mobile device groups and computer groups and user groups are all groups, and they all work in the same group-like kind of ways. So all of that common behavior is defined in the group class, which inherits from the API object class. The same is true for advanced searches and extension attributes for mobile devices, computers, and users. All of their common code is in a generic abstract class. We also use Mixin modules a lot. Mixin modules are a Ruby thing that some object-oriented languages let you inherit from multiple parents, so you get all of the properties of this thing and all of the properties of that thing mixed together in your new class. In Ruby, you can only have one parent class, but you can mix in modules of code that you can share with other places. And we do a lot of that here. For example, computer, mobile devices, and peripherals all include the purchasable module because they all have purchasing data. And the API hands that purchasing data to you in exactly the same format for all of those objects. So rather than write the code to deal with the purchasing stuff 3 times, I wrote it once, put it in a module, and then mixed that module in. So now they all get to use it, and they all use it in exactly the same way. This is an interesting one, criteriable. Some things have criteria. Smart groups have criteria, and advanced searches have criteria. Criteria can be pretty complicated. So there's a module called criteriable, which gives criteriability to whatever you mix it into. And that also creates 2 sub-objects, a criterion and a criteria, that you work with as objects to define inside your searches. And then I only had to write that code once. Here's an example of how mix-ins are used. Computer objects mix in the extendable, locatable, purchasable, updatable, uploadable, and matchable submodules. So let's look at all of these modules that are part of the gem and see what they do. Creatable is the code that lets you create an object in the JSS. Updatable is the code that lets you update an object in the JSS. Locatable is for objects that have location data in the JSS. Purchasable, we talked about for things with purchasing data. Extendable for, this is different. Extendable is things that have extension attribute data, not the extension attributes themselves, which are another kind of object. But computers, mobile devices, and users have extension attribute data stored within them. And this code is what lets you work with that data and get reports from them and stuff like that. Scopable, we mentioned, things that can be scoped. The only one of those I've implemented is policies. I haven't yet had to do anything with profiles, which can be scoped, but I think I'm going to be writing that very soon, so eventually it'll show up there. Criteriable, I mentioned, for things that can contain criteria. Uploadable. This one's a little tricky. This means API uploads, not uploading to your distribution points. The API itself can handle uploads of, say, attachments. You know, you can look at a computer and have an attachment, a file attached to it. That's actually stored in the database. And the API gives you a way to upload stuff into the database like that. So things that support that, I have a module for dealing with it. And matchable, some things like computers and mobile devices have the API lets you do simple search matches, just like at the top of the computer's page or this mobile device page, you do the quick simple search for a name or an ID number or whatever, and it gives you all the matches. This module supports that aspect of the API. So once again, if you're going to be doing any work to extend the actual gem, read the documentation. It has a lot of information that you need. For example, in a lot of other languages like Objective-C, when you're going to subclass something, you have to adhere to certain protocols. You have to do certain things with your new class, or else it won't work as a subclass. And the same is true here. When you make a subclass of API object, you have to provide certain constants and certain methods that work in a certain way, or else it won't work. And that's all in the documentation. So included in the gem, there's 2 small example programs, and I'll show you a couple screenshots from them. I was originally during the Q&A going to have, I've got a laptop with a JSS on it, and I was going to try to do some live work with these examples, but getting it set up here was too hard. Afterwards, or sometime around during lunchtime, I'll probably go up to one of the free classrooms upstairs, and if you want to see some of this in action on a live machine, come find me in the classrooms upstairs in level 8, and I'll show you how all this stuff works for real. So there's, first of the example programs is called cgrouper. It's just a little command line tool. That's just its help screen for working with computer groups. It lets you list them, create them, rename them, and delete them, edit their membership, all from the command line, all scriptable. We use it for several different things. I wrote it quite a while ago before I had support for creating smart groups through the API, so it only lets you edit static groups. But it lets you list all the different groups. The other one is called Subnet Update. I wrote this because, as I mentioned before, our network team maintains all the official data about our subnets in a GitHub, or not GitHub, but a Git repository, a local Git repository. And they update it all the time, multiple times a week, things change. And in order to keep it seamlessly up to date in the JSS, I have code that uses the API to pull down their Git repository, parse out their stuff, get the actual network segments, put it up into the JSS. And it'll really just, it takes, this one I simplified, it just takes a delimited file of starting addresses, ending addresses, and names, and it makes the JSS match whatever's in the file. If it is in the file, it'll get deleted from the JSS. If it's changed in the JSS, or on the file, then it'll change in the JSS. If it's new in the file, it'll get created in the JSS. So that's another sample. D3 is the package deployment system that I mentioned earlier. It is not yet available. It's a very large separate project, but I'm hoping I can release it sometime in the first half of next year. And now that we have an announcement about patch management built in sometime in the future, I will be in communication with Jamf to make sure D3 uses that or doesn't interfere with it. Here's what it is. It's a patch management system for Casper. We've been using it for about 5 years. It gives Casper these abilities to recognize that, hey, these 2 packages are different versions of the same thing, and you can automatically upload packages to the JSS, and then you can test them before actually pushing them out, and then once you say go, they just automatically go out everywhere they should. And hey, puppies. I actually had to rework the puppies lately because the way we used to do them broke in Mavericks, so now I'm using Jamf Helper, and it works great. Little slideshow of puppies. When the user logs out and it's updating the OS, they get to watch cute puppies. So yeah, and all of this is command line. We're a very command line oriented shop, so all of this stuff is command line. And that means that you can script it and automate it even more. So, and yes, once again, it is all open source. There's the data. And that email, right now it just goes to me. I created it yesterday. So yeah, email JSS API gem@pixar.com if you have some questions. It'll come to my box and I'll probably answer you. And I'm Chris L. on Jamf Nation. So there we go. That's a quick overview.
So you got all that right? No questions? All right. Well, I'm gonna run around now
Okay.
and see if people have questions. If I can get down the stairs.
Questions? Right in front to start. Oh, no, there first, and then you can pass the.
Can I go right here?
Yep.
First?
Yep.
Okay. You don't want to cross Chris. Just.
So how does your workflow deal with scoping packages when your network segments are constantly changing via script?
We don't scope by network segments.
Okay, very good.
And they don't change that much. But there's, of the network segments that get defined by the network team, a lot of them are like on weird subnets that have to do with servers and render farms and all that. For the actual machine, the networks that the machines are going to be on, they don't change that much. And we have some manually defined broader ones that we use most of the time. I think I have a feature request in. I would love a way to group network segments so that I can scope by a group of them at any given time. Rather than, because like in one of our buildings, there might be 13 different subnets, and the way they're named and the way they get added to the JSS, when I see the big huge list to do the scoping, it's like that one and that one and that one and that one, did I get them all? I would love to be able to define.
I smell a feature request.
Yeah, I think it already is a feature request, but up it.
Have you open sourced any of the Puppy Time Jamf helper
No,
code?
that's part of D3 that I'm hopefully going to open source next year. That is built on this. So even though we've been using it for a while, I had to get this version written, and then I can do D3, which includes Puppy Time.
If I understand correctly, part of this is supposed to run on the client machines as part of, say, scripts or policies. Does this work on all the system Rubies that you can expect on, say, older?
I've made it work with Ruby 1.8.7 and 2.0, which are the ones that come with Mavericks. 1.8.7 is probably going to fall out. I think I've heard rumor that, I don't know about I know in early versions of Yosemite in the developer previews, 1.8.7 wasn't there. I'm hoping they actually are going to leave it. I don't know. Who's got Yosemite? Is Ruby 1.8.7 there? If not, I've got a lot of work to do before we can push out everything, because all my code is for 1.8.7 because that's what was there before. But yes, I've tested it in both 1.8.7 and 2.0. It should work fine in 2.1 also. Anyone else? John, up there, John.
I was just wondering about you mentioned you cannot save the password in the config, and I was wondering why that is.
Because it's just a plain text file, and that's insecure.
But in a case where, I'm thinking in our application monkey box, we might want to offer our subscribers the ability to, plug their own JSS.
If you want to save it in a file, then your code can save it in a file and read it from somewhere, and then just pipe it in or pass it in just fine. That's up to you. I didn't want the code that I'm releasing to do something that insecure. But I don't stop you from doing it. It just won't do it in the files that my configuration object uses. It won't pay any attention to anything like that. But you can do your own. Anyone else? Oh, back again, down front.
Going down the stairs is a lot harder.
Follow-up question to the password stuff. How do you store those?
We retrieve them from secure sites inside when we need them. All the standard security things apply. Of course, when you connect to the JSS using this thing, whatever username you connect with, whatever privileges it has is what you're going to have with your code. So don't have an administrator account used out there just to do some lookups of computers or something. Set up different accounts with different levels of privilege, and then treat your passwords accordingly. Be careful with them. How many Ruby programmers are out there? 1, 2, 3. I know there's not many. We live in a very Python-oriented world, and Ruby and Python aren't that different from each other, so try it out.
Ruby's pretty straightforward to pick up if you've done any programming at all.
Yeah.
It's easy enough to get installed and start playing around with.
Yeah, if you've done any Objective-C programming, Ruby is like Objective-C extra light.
Don't be scared off of Ruby by the Objective-C cross-reference.
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle. Oh. I'm just going to come and sit right there.
Is the code site aware?
Is it site aware? Not really. We only have one site. There is, the site data that comes down from the API is in there. We are probably going to actually be setting up a second site soon, so I'll probably start figuring out what that means. But hey, send questions and examples of how you want things to work, and we can start getting stuff in there. Yeah, basically the data is there. I do implement site objects, but site objects are pretty minimal. They're basically a name and an ID number. They're just used to tie other things together. So, anything else? No 187? Is, oh, yeah.
You want to repeat that? So
Yeah, it sounds like it doesn't exist. Actually, if you look in library frameworks ruby.framework, dig down into there and into the place where it says versions, and you'll see if the other one's there and just not in use.
Yeah, it's 2.0.
It's just 2.0?
So the confirmation on Yosemite is you have Ruby 2.0.
Yes, not 187. So if you have Ruby code that doesn't work in 2.0 and does in 187, you've got to port it before you can move to Yosemite.
A follow-up question on the password question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible maybe you could make it so we can base 64 encode the username : the password, and then provide that in the file instead of having to pipe in a password?
Probably what I'll
like
do
that?
is I'll give you an example of how to save a password somewhere on your own and retrieve it, and then just use it, separate from the actual config file.
Okay, will that be on the GitHub?
Yeah, I'll update the documentation with an example of that, and the documentation will show you. And
Thank you.
the stuff that talks about configuration.
I'm trying to bump up my health data on iOS 8. I don't know how many people are using that. So come on, I need a question
Make
down
them
there
do
now.
sprints up and down.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I don't see any.
Oh, there we go. Oh. Way over there. All right, pass this one down.
It might be out of scope for this discussion, but have you looked at Swift and using it?
Do I what?
Have you looked at Swift?
I have looked at Swift, and I probably won't end up using it just because right now, I used to use MacRuby when MacRuby was a thing to write my GUI apps, and then MacRuby went away and became RubyMotion, which is a commercial product. But when that started, it was for iOS only. It does do Mac. You can do Mac UI stuff with it now too. But I had a couple of GUI-based Ruby applications that I needed to port quickly in order to get them to work in, even before Mavericks, things started breaking with MacRuby. So since a lot of Pixar's internal stuff uses Qt, which is another cross-platform graphic UI framework, I just started using that because that has Ruby hooks too. And I ported my two things to there. And since Pixar uses Qt internally, and I don't think it's going to stop anytime, I'm probably just going to use that instead of using Swift. And Swift is this interesting mix of Objective-C and a lot of Ruby and a little bit of Python and a few other things mixed in there. It's a pretty interesting language. And if I didn't have that kind of Qt foundation already in place, I probably would start using it. Is that it?
I have a question for the crowd. How many of you have a test environment along with your production environment? So you get a new release. Well, that's awesome to see.
Yeah.
A tool like this, one of the things we do internally at Jamf is we actually use Ruby, and there's some extensions to it that you can drive the UI of the JSS for testing. A combination with what Chris has put together is a quick way to automate some tests against that, so you don't necessarily have to test everything by hand. So there's a lot of power in this. Maybe you want to pull data from your production environment, toss it into your test environment, automate those tests so those can run at night while you're drinking beer at First Avenue. And your boss thinks you're working really hard. It can even send out emails. But again, these things can be very, very powerful and make them very repeatable to use them that way.
Yeah,
So.
and if you make the effort to learn a little bit of Ruby enough to use this, then your use of the API just becomes so much simpler. How much XML did you see up there? You don't have to think about it. Actually, the code that I wrote pulls down the JSON version of the stuff, but it still has to push back up XML. Someday I hope I can push back up JSON too.
I'm not listening. I'm not listening.
But yeah, I mean, when I started using the API, I was like, parsing all this XML and what. So I just want to do that once. So I did it once here. And now I've got a much simpler tool, and I can just grab objects as I need them, manipulate them, and send them back. And it's way easier.
Anything else? How about another big hand for Chris?
Yay, thank you.